Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Account and Coca Report. We are delighted to have as our guest Professor Gabriela Gomes, who is a professor of mathematics and statistics at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. And I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. The Scottish always have, perhaps Professor Gomes will correct us on the pronunciation of her institution. But she's a professor of mathematics specializing in population dynamics and specifically in epidemiology and the spread of infections and the question of herd immunity. She's done work for the last 10 years regarding herd immunity in various infectious diseases, tuberculosis and malaria. And lately has published very interesting papers that have caught a lot of attention about, of course, COVID-19 and the question of herd immunity with COVID-19, and it's a very hot topic that is on everybody's mind. Professor Gomes, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So how do you pronounce, is it Strathclyde? Is it simple enough as this?
I think it is Strathclyde, but
right.
But I'm Portuguese, so there you go. I may doing it wrong too.
Okay, good. So before we get started, I think, most of us are have familiarity with the concept of herd immunity, but nevertheless, can you tell us in just, briefly what the concept means, how it emerged in the epidemiology literature, over the decades, and what our understanding of it is? Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's actually an old concept in mathematical epidemiology. So basically, what it means when you have a susceptible population that is invaded by a virus or some other kind of pathogen, you have an epidemic growing. And exponentially initially, and then it gets, it gets slower, and the growth becomes slower and slower, even if it let them mitigate it. And then at some point you have a peak, and the number of cases after that start coming down. That peak is when herd immunity threshold is achieved. So basically what it means is that once you have herd immunity, the epidemic no longer grows. So that's if you have an epidemic and mitigate it. When you control you try to control the epidemic and try to suppress it in some way, it will not reach the peak in the same way. It will slow down earlier because of the interventions. But then if you relax the interventions, let's say you have controlled the epidemic with interventions, and then you relax the interventions, and it may start growing again. The epidemic starts growing again because it was being suppressed by the interventions. You lift the interventions, it can start growing again. If you don't have herd immunity, if you have herd immunity, that you don't expect it to start growing again, even if you lift the interventions. So I think that's the interesting concept in the case of this COVID pandemic. We want to know how much of the population would need to be immune, so we can relax the interventions without worrying that the epidemic will grow again. So the usefulness of this concept is in relation to our normal behavior conditions. We want to know if our behavior goes back to normal, is that safe?
Right. Thank you very much. That's a very good way of putting it, because it's relevant to all of our concerns. And it's related. I think there's also a different way of thinking about herd immunity, which classically, at least the way I remember it from before, it's the same concept, but seen from a different angle. And the idea was that you have herd immunity if a sufficient number of people in the population are immune, so that no new outbreaks take place. A little bit, I mean, in a way that it has less to do with, it has to do with this sort of this time factor and this second peak. But it's, instead of viewing at it on a trajectory, if you will, where we're all familiar with these graphs where you have sort of your timeline and then you have a peak and then maybe a second peak, the idea would be, you have a population and, a certain percentage of them are immune, and therefore, you may have new cases, but there's no big outbreak that takes place. Because I think that, in the 1930s, when the concept of herd immunity was first discovered, it was primarily this recognition. When there was no question of mitigation or no mitigation, it had to do with rubella and measles and whatnot, that epidemiologists discovered that, there were no outbreaks in certain cases when sufficient numbers of people were infected. And then if you waited a little bit longer and the number of immune people, there were new babies that had not been exposed, then you would have a new outbreak, that sort of thing. So they're related, and thank you for...
that's very much the thinking about vaccination. You can also vaccinate if you have a vaccine and you want to prevent an epidemic. You want to know what is the herd immunity threshold, because that tells you how many people you should vaccinate in order to prevent the new outbreaks, in order to prevent outbreaks in our population.
So what's the classical way of estimating these herd immunity thresholds? The percentage of the population over which we're less likely to have outbreaks, or...
Yeah, if you have a model, if you have if you have a model for the disease you are studying, for the infectious disease you are studying, you can you can either just do it directly by simulation. You see when the peak of the epidemic occurs, when the epidemic curves, and you see when the peak happens, and then you go and see what is the percentage of the population that is immune then at the peak. So I think that's probably the most intuitive way of seeing that. And of course, you can also do mathematical analysis. You can analyze your model mathematically, and you can derive a formula for the herd immunity threshold in terms of the model parameters. And if the model is homogeneous, in the sense that individuals are equally susceptible and equally exposed to infection and equally infectious if infected, so if you make all these homogeneity assumptions, then there is a very simple formula for the herd immunity threshold as a function of R0, the basic reproduction number. It's 1 minus 1 over R0. So R0 here is the average number of secondary cases created by one infected individual. So it makes sense that the larger the R0, the larger the herd immunity threshold. So the larger the R0, the more individuals you need to have immunized in your population before you can sort of be confident that you can effectively prevent future outbreaks.
Right. So again, the R0 would be, if you have, say, sometimes we see those in papers, you have a Venn diagram with people in that Venn diagram, and they're all susceptible. I mean, they're all sort of clear and neutral. And then you have one person infected, glowing red. And then the next generation, 5 are infected, glowing red, because the R0 would be, if the R0 is 5. And the R0 has to do with what it's a characteristics of the agent. It's a characteristic of a number of factors. What factors would that be?
All of that. So it's a characteristic of the pathogen. Some pathogens are more easily transmitted than others. And we talk about in the case of COVID, we talk about if it is transmitted by droplets or aerosol, or if it stays in surfaces and for very long, and for how long. So it depends. So this is one of the factors that determine how transmissible the virus is, and it depends on the individual susceptibilities. So one person is exposed to, if we have one susceptible individual exposed to one infected individual, there is a probability that this contact will result in infection. So that has to do with the susceptibility of the susceptible individual, and also with, of course, the infectiousness, as we discussed before, the infectiousness of the infected individual. And it depends on social behavior. It depends on how connected people are in society. So like, if one individual meets 10 persons a day, this individual is less at risk than one individual that meets 100 individuals in one day. So it depends on all these factors that
Right.
these determine R naught.
But the R naught is supposed to be a sort of a characteristic, typical or average transmissibility number.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then so the classical model for related to COVID-19 would have used an R naught that is common for respiratory viruses of that kind to come up with an estimate of the herd immunity thresholds.
Yeah, and that R naught has actually been, it can also be estimated from the initial growth of the epidemic. So if you run a model from that exponential phase of the epidemic, so if you run a model with R naught equal 2, it will grow slower than if you run a model with R naught equal 10. And so there will be this optimal fit for the of the output of the model to the data that is being collected as the epidemic unfolds and new cases are being counted. So I think what mathematical epidemiologists do a lot is to fit these models to the epidemic curves and estimate the parameters that make a curve that is most similar to the data that's being collected.
So in terms of the initial phases of this epidemic, is there agreement between modelers about what the R naught was in various populations or for COVID-19?
Yeah, I think that's been quite good convergence on that. So of course, R naught is not the same for every population. If you are in a big city or if you are in a small village, you expect different R naughts. But I think that's been quite agreeable.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is that number for COVID-19? Sort of, I mean, roughly.
Yeah, it's been between 2.5, 3, 4. So it's got
Okay.
a range of values. I think the estimates became larger. Sort of became larger later. So the initial estimates were between 2 and 3, and then as models became more elaborate, we could see estimates that were tending to become higher, like 4 or 5.
Dr. Gomez, the original data that was coming out for this virus was from Wuhan. Were you paying attention to the virus then, and were you kind of following what was going on at that time?
Yeah, I was paying attention more as an observer than
Right.
as a researcher at that time, mainly for personal reasons. When the epidemic started, I was moving institutions. I was starting my new job in Scotland. I was moving from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine to the University of Strathclyde. So I was busy organizing the move, and then they said, well, everybody needs to go home because we are going to work from home. So I didn't have a home in the UK, so I actually came home to Portugal. So right now I'm in Portugal. That's where my family is. That's where I come from.
So I'm curious of that original. Now that we kind of can look back and see what all the different places that data came from. One was, of course, Wuhan. Then there was this Diamond Princess cruise, right? The issues with in terms of actually figuring out what that R naught is partly that you don't know exactly how many cases exist, right? So that was one of the problems with the data from China, from Wuhan, was that we just didn't know what numbers to believe, correct? And as time has progressed, the data has gotten much better. Early on, what's the best? Just looking forward for this happen again. What's the best place to kind of get a sense of how to estimate R naught? Is it these little cruise ships that are like floating cities, or how do we what's the best way forward?
I think you are if you are in a more natural a ship is a special environment. It's not like people going about their life,
Right.
their normal life in a city or in wherever they live. So I would tend to be more interested in data from
right.
normal.
How do you interpret data from Wuhan when you don't have the cases and stuff? Do you just wait until, I mean, how does one come up with numbers when you have so much data that may be missing?
Yeah, well, epidemiologists can also design special studies to measure the R0 directly. So this fitting the model to the epidemic curve is not the only way. So you can do contact tracing and try to identify how many people in person infected. Of course, there's all the asymptomatics that also count for how many infections one person generated, and that's not feasible in many cases unless you do a special study. So there's lots of difficulties. There's lots of uncertainty. There's also the fact that the new cases, so the daily new cases, they don't account for asymptomatics. So there must be other kind of studies that are specially designed to estimate what's the proportion of all infections that actually have symptoms. But I haven't been involved in those studies.
Does it make sense to you, given that R0 differs so much from population to population for a number of different reasons? Of course, the New York City, hyperdense, everyone's living on top of each other, has very different R0 than say a farming community, right? Does it make sense to have to talk about one R0, or should we refer to R0s within?
Yeah,
should we have an R0 for New York City and R0s for rural places?
I think so. I think we need to treat each setting as a special case.
Perhaps you're right. I think we'll come back to that. I think it's a very good point. We'll come back to it maybe at the end. But more on the technical side, does the test characteristics of a test to detect, the virus, does that impact on the estimation of R0? Or, for example, if you have a test that is only 70% sensitive, so long as it's 70% sensitive across the board each time, does that still allow you to estimate the R0? Or would the R0 change if the test was 100% sensitive or 50% sensitive? You know what I'm saying? So these PCR tests, or is R0 influenced by the test performance?
Yeah, but the estimates of R0 usually come with, or they should come with a confidence interval, so to allow for uncertainty. So the initial studies did that a lot. I think it was very important to do that early on.
But based on what you're saying, this initial data is very important, because once an epidemic is sort of out in the open, people are going to react to it. I mean, whether it's through imposed lockdown measures or whatnot, or even spontaneous, right? So, and that will affect the R0, right? That will introduce a different virus. So you will have the R0 au naturel, if you want, sort of when people are unsuspecting, versus the R0 at time T, down the line when people have already changed their behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the model needs to account for these changes in R0 due to interventions.
But it seems almost impossible. It seems almost impossible to know before things have happened or before things have played out what that R0 eventually be. Did you find that we were told in March when we were listening to whatever experts were anointed at the time that 1 - 1 over R0 was the herd immunity threshold, and based on a number of 3 or R0 of 2.5, 3, that you needed a herd immunity threshold of 60%. Did you, and you've been in this world for a long time, and we're going to get to your work, but did you believe that from the get-go that's what herd immunity threshold probably would be, that you needed 60% to get infected?
Well, I have been working on individual variation in infectious diseases, and I'm for the last 10 years almost exclusively on that. So that's been the core of my research for the last 10 years, and I have a very good intuition for what this kind of heterogeneity does to the output of the models. And the first thing that came to mind to me is that heterogeneity tends to make epidemics smaller. For given the same R naught, if you have this model and two models, one that's homogeneous and the other has heterogeneity and susceptibility, for example, and you set the models running with same R naught, and the epidemic is much smaller when you have variation. So the more variation you have in susceptibility or exposure, the smaller the epidemic becomes. If the epidemic is smaller, of course, that means that the herd immunity threshold is lower.
Yeah, we should say that for the folks that haven't aren't understanding part of what you're saying in terms of your work. Your work is a lot on heterogeneity. That the models, 1 minus 1 over R naught, employs this SIR model, right? Susceptibility, infection, recovery, and part of one of the major assumptions in that is that 100% of people, when a virus comes on, when a novel virus or some virus lands in a population, 100% of people are just as susceptible, meaning they're all homogeneously susceptible, correct? And your work that you've been doing for a decade actually has been looking at a bunch of other epidemics and showing that, hey, look, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Not everyone is susceptible, and therefore we can't quite make the normal base assumption. So you're being very polite, but when in March people were saying that there's a 60% herd immunity threshold, this matters a lot because that's how we make these massive decisions on locking down economy shutdown, schools shutdown, etc. It's because those are modeled on 50-60% herd immunity thresholds, and if you take a 1% mortality or whatever age stratified mortality you want to take, the numbers that they were talking about were 3 million dead in the United States, 1 million dead in the United Kingdom. That's what was being said by, for instance, Niall Ferguson in the Imperial College back in March as a rationale to lock down. You're saying that when you heard about this at the time in mid-March, you would not have come up with an estimate anywhere near that. Because
no, back in March, I was already running my models and I was already talking about it in the Portuguese media. I'm here in Portugal and I was being interviewed by journalists here in Portugal. And I was already talking about herd immunity thresholds 20% or lower. So basically 1/3, so epidemic sizes would be 1/3 of what homogeneous models suggest, and herd immunity thresholds would be about 1/3 or even less what homogeneous models suggest and what was being presented globally. And I just continue doing the work following this line of research.
So the one point is that if you have rural communities, correct? These rural communities may have an R naught that's much lower than 2.5, right? And so, if you have a rural community, it may, their policy should be affected by the fact that they're a rural community that's not New York City, correct? Like it doesn't make sense. Like New York City seems to be for us, the United States, a worst case scenario because so many people died. 1,000 people a day were dying, unfortunately, in New York City. And because of that, there's a massive amount of fear. And now the entire country, in some way or the other, is locked down. But even if you use that base model, and we don't even introduce the concept of heterogeneity, right? It would seem to not make a tremendous amount of sense to take these populations that are so much different than New York City and apply the same policy to all of them. Because is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think I think the discourse has been very polarized for some reason, as if you are really talking about two possible disjoint strategies, so with completely opposed objectives. That's how it's been sort of presented. Like when you have one strategy of just mitigating the epidemic and allow herd immunity to be built, and another different strategy, which would be to suppress the epidemic as much as possible, to try to reduce the cases to the bare minimum, and that the idea is that this would impair the development of herd immunity. So you just have to stay like that, or more or less like that, maybe intermittently like that, until there was a vaccine to generate this herd immunity by vaccination. it makes sense to think about these strategies being so different when you think that herd immunity threshold is very high, like 60% or higher. But when you admit that the herd immunity threshold may be just 10 to 20%, then the two strategies become the same. Because under suppression, when you follow the strategy of suppressing the epidemic as much as you can, it's impossible to reduce cases to absolute zero. No one thinks that, and you have these cases occurring at very low levels, and that does not impair the development of herd immunity. So under suppression and under lockdown, you may still come out of it with herd immunity. So you don't need to encourage people to go and infect themselves and let themselves be infected intentionally. You don't need to do that. Even if you try to reduce cases to a bare minimum, herd immunity can still happen, and it's happening, I think.
So but then why would be the point of locking down if you're going to reach it so quickly?
You save lives, okay. save lives, and
because maybe even at 10 or 20%, if it happens quick enough, you could overwhelm the hospitals and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, you can still. That's another thing. If there is always overshoot, so the epidemic is always bigger than the herd immunity threshold. And the more you suppress, the less that difference between the actual epidemic final size and the herd immunity threshold. Yeah. So okay. So if you suppress, there will be an optimal kind of there should be an optimal strategy that reduces the overshoot. That minimizes the overshoot. Right. Yeah, if you don't suppress, the overshoot could be large.
But if you suppress too much, I was going to talk about this later. But if you suppress too much, correct, early on, then so you have how do you then don't you just do the same? Don't you just do the same thing later on?
But it's very rare to be able to actually suppress too much. I've analyzed, we've analyzed 4 European countries. It was Portugal, Spain, Belgium, and UK. And I'm pretty sure that at least Portugal, Spain, and Belgium just did their best to suppress early and reduced cases to a minimum. UK may have had a few days delay, a week delay or so, comparing with the other countries in terms of when the lockdown was implemented. But even these countries that try to suppress to the best of their capacity, they still, I think we are still coming out of it with herd immunity.
And
we don't come out of lockdown exactly with herd immunity, but after lockdown, you don't just open up completely suddenly. So there is this gradual, because people are worried and we want to be vigilant, and people want to try to get their own perception of whether it's really safe to go out and meet people or not. So there's always gradual, so coming out of, so relaxing social distancing, it's always inevitably gradually, happens gradually. And we see if the herd immunity threshold was very high, you start relaxing social distancing and the cases would just go up. So the growth of cases would just go up very quickly, very soon after you start relaxing the social distancing. But with the herd immunity threshold being so low, that actually may start to grow a little bit, not everywhere. The parts of the country who were most affected continue to decline after lockdown has been lifted, and of course there are always parts of the country that were less affected in the first wave, and that's where you see outbreaks. So when you see the second wave, it's just heterogeneous throughout the country. It's not the entire country that goes in a second wave. It's just it's just parts of the country who have been less affected. Well, they will be affected later, but the experience, what I see happening in the countries I'm more familiar with, they seem to be getting controlled.
Your graphs, that you from this paper that you have in that you posted in July, right? That shows Belgium, which had a pretty significant wave, correct? It shows England that had a pretty significant wave, lots and lots of cases. And in those particular cases, your curves, you're not predicting a second. Am I misreading the thing? You're not predicting a second
it's just,
hump.
yeah,
Whereas in Spain and Portugal, there appears to be a second hump, but they also have, again, for different reasons, they have, maybe parts of Portugal and Spain that were very suppressed, so they open up. Catalonia versus Madrid, right? Catalonia is where second surges.
We also do subnational analysis. There's actually a little bit of a research everywhere. In England, you see a little bit of a second wave, but it's very shallow. It's almost invisible in those plots, and the same for the same for Belgium. I think the dynamics are qualitatively the same in all the countries. It's just the second wave seems to be more prominent in Portugal and Spain comparing with the other countries.
Is that because no? So that's what I'm asking. I mean, what if Catalonia, for instance, instead of locking down severely, what if they had just masked and socially distanced and canceled football games type of thing? Would that not be enough? Like what this wave that they're having now, right? I mean, technically in Catalonia, that part of the population, they are not at herd immunity, right? It's assuming, and we're going to go into how you calculated these things. Catalonia is not at herd immunity, whereas Madrid did go to herd immunity. And when Madrid did go to herd immunity, they had a lot of cases, partly because they were unprepared, they weren't socially distancing, they were still at markets, they were doing all that stuff, right? So that's why they have such a big case peak, and that's why they have so many deaths that overshoot. You may explain the deaths as well. But why is it that we don't assume that in Catalonia, where you see that second bump, which it's pretty small, it's really easy to manage, it's not some massive problem, right? And that is because they're all being careful, right? They're socially distancing, washing hands more. So, I mean, isn't it fair to assume that if we all just did what they're doing in Catalonia or what they're doing in, Portugal or wherever, that you would have not a big thing? Meaning, why did Catalonia have to lock down at all?
Okay, the first wave would have been large. I don't think we would want a first wave let unmitigated. If you have my figures, that will be the black curves in the figures is is the unmitigated epidemic. I think it would be large. I look at it and I think it's, I say, I wouldn't want to be
unmitigated
there.
Means doing nothing.
Yes.
But I'm talking, but that's doing nothing. But if you wear masks, if you socially distance, if you sanitize your hands, if you don't go to football games, etc., then is it not the case that Madrid would have had the same thing as Catalonia? Meaning Madrid didn't know. So Madrid, that first city that gets hit hard, they just don't know because they're doing everything. R naught is super high, etc. Right? But
Madrid already, Catalonia already had some cases during the first wave. It just had a small first wave, and now it's having a small second wave.
Okay.
Let
me. I mean, on that note, just for clarity, when you in your work, this concept of susceptibility, it's a property of the individual person, right? As opposed, and you entangle this from the connections between people, right? I mean, these are two things that can be sort of varied in the model, right? And so the susceptibility is really a physical property of the individual, whether it's T cells or whether whatever it is, prior exposures to an ancient coronavirus, whatever it is, we don't know. And that's one thing. And then the other thing would be the connectivity which you track by the Google data, the Google mobility data.
We actually have two formalisms, two mathematical formalisms for the model. One, because mathematically it needs to be slightly different. So when we want to model heterogeneity and susceptibility, we have one model. So we have a susceptible pool at the beginning. Everybody's susceptible at the beginning, but not equally susceptible. So there will be some individuals have a score, their susceptibility score, some have a high susceptibility score, others have a lower. And then when infection, when the virus comes, it's going to infect more easily the individuals that are more susceptible. So there's going to be a selection, there's going to be a kind of natural selection happening in the pool of susceptibility. And if that pool of susceptibility starts with a certain average susceptibility, with a certain mean of susceptibility, that mean is not constant. It will get smaller and smaller as the highly susceptible individuals become infected and immune and develop immunity. So they are removed. These more susceptible individuals are actually the first ones to be removed from susceptible pool. So susceptible pool is not, so the mean susceptibility decreases over time. It's dynamic. Mm-hmm. And the homogeneous models kind of disable this process in making individuals equally susceptible in this pool. Selection cannot happen. It's not there. So different susceptibility is not there explicit in the model. So selection cannot happen, and the model, the model works all the way through the epidemic with the same mean susceptibility. It doesn't have this declining mean susceptibility.
So just introducing this susceptibility, this idea, I mean, that would be a break that gets stronger and stronger over time, right?
Exactly.
So there's sort of an acceleration of, you know, it's interesting because, I mean, it's always, I mean, it's hard to tell, but if I remember reflecting in late March about the, you know, Wuhan and Korea and whatnot. I mean, they seem to have, of course, Wuhan imposed very severe lockdown very quickly. At least it seemed that way. And it had, you know, within 8 weeks, the whole thing was gone. Korea also within 8 weeks. I mean, they seem to have sort of the same time frame. And it seemed strange that if we were to believe the models of, you know, the unmitigated, the homogeneous models, that could be achieved with lockdown or without lockdowns. It seemed that it would be overwhelming, that the force. So it seems to be that it speaks to that there must be some existence of some kind of break, some kind of natural break that makes these things eventually manageable. And that may be true in the history of mankind. I mean, you know, we've survived these things, right? I mean, they rarely wipe out populations completely, right? I mean, we just, there are waves and then it goes away.
Yeah, I've been asking a lot, what does your model have to say about the flu pandemic of 1918?
Right, and that's was going to be my next question.
I just can't wait to, you know, when I have time, when I have a couple of days free, I'm just going to try those models on that pandemic. I haven't done it yet.
Okay, because there,
from what I read, the numbers I read about the percentage of the populations that got infected, it seemed very consistent, and the estimates of Arnaud, it seems very consistent with the numbers we are getting with our heterogeneity models.
Right. So that's I want to make that clear, because that's an important point, because at face value, it seems that the flu epidemic of 1918, 1919 would contradict a little bit what you're saying, because you have these, you know, large wave, and then another very large wave, and then yet another large wave, and so forth. And so it would at least on the surface seem to indicate that you know, susceptibility is not, I mean,
okay,
the people who missed the first wave got the.
Yeah, I have to say that I don't know the data very well for the 1918 pandemic, but you know, motivated by that and those questions that have been posed to me recently, I've just been reading some historical papers of 100 years ago, and I see estimates of attack rates of 20-30%. So I see those values reported in the literature. Of course, I'd have to look to analyze it myself and try to fit those models to it. But it seems consistent. In terms of the second wave, why I don't expect to be a large second wave for these, and at least not in the countries that were severely affected or even moderately affected in a first wave. I don't expect very large second waves for this. But the influenza virus has a difference in comparison with coronavirus, which is its ability to mutate and escape immunity. That's actually one of the drivers for these seasonal epidemics we have every year. The need for a new vaccine every year is because the virus is always escaping the immunity that we develop in response to it. So the coronavirus, I hear, again, I'm not a virologist, I'm not an immunologist, but what I hear is that the coronavirus doesn't do that. It doesn't have such ability to drift. That is called the antigenic drift that the influenza virus does. So, I'm
right. So in which case, what it would be, it conceivably could be that in 1918, 1919, you had conceivably 3 different agents, right? That they were not second waves.
Yeah,
but
they were slightly modified.
Different enough that the susceptibility was less important.
Yeah, and it was the end of the war, of the Second World War as well. Right. So society was not constant in any way. It was just between 1918 and 1919 was different. Soldiers would have returned home, and
right. That speaks to what Anish was mentioning earlier. Is that when we think about a community and we have these models, I mean, it's kind of artificial because in real life, I mean, it's so fluid, so dynamic. I mean, what constitutes a community, changes over time, and it's I mean, now we have travel and all that stuff. So you have to, I mean, you have to keep that in mind. I mean, it's right.
Yeah,
the models assume a set, right, an n. I mean, you have to be able to work your mathematics. But in real life, there's a lot of
I think the models are tools that help us make sense of the data. They are meant to help us analyze the data. I don't think these models, especially models done in such a short time frame as it's the case when you have an emergency. So we just try to develop tools that I understand the data better if I analyze it in light of a model, even if it is a homogeneous model, then if it is just by looking at the data. So I think it helps us make sense of the data. And we are not intending to include everything and every fluctuation that we see, anything that happens in reality. We don't put that in the models usually. So what I did to the models was to add one aspect that I had found with my previous work that was important because it leads to different results, may lead to different conclusions, and it was this individual variation in susceptibility or in connectivity. So that's the other model. So we did these 2 versions of the model. We also did a similar, we just did the work in parallel for heterogeneity in susceptibility or heterogeneity in connectivity. Eventually we can blend the models and develop a hybrid and try to estimate how much of the variation is attributed to susceptibility and how much it is attributed to connectivity, but we haven't done that yet. That's the time frame we have. We just started in mid-March.
So basically, you are introducing the idea of various amounts of susceptibility in a population, and then making curves and looking to see if the curves fit the epidemics in terms of cases that have happened. Correct?
Yeah.
Right?
Good question. Yeah. Good points. Yeah.
And so. And that's because the point about estimating heterogeneity is so incredibly important because how it relates to herd immunity. Because if we already have herd immunity in Madrid, if we already have herd immunity in New York, then that should affect what we do. Right now, people are terrified in many different places of should we open up? Can we go to restaurants? Can we allow places of business to open? And so this becomes so important. So estimating heterogeneity is like super important. And part of the problem for, dum-dums like me and Michelle is that we have no idea how one goes about estimating heterogeneity. A lot of epidemiologists that have been the ones who have been talking a lot ever since the beginning in March, they continue to say today, Dr. Gomes, that herd immunity thresholds will not be reached until we get to 40-50% susceptible. Even places like Spain and New York, they're still far, far, far away from herd immunity. And so that we need to continue to have, reasonably severe restrictive measures in place until until we get a vaccine or until we get susceptible. So how does one count? How do you
well
respond to
let's perhaps you can tell us what because I don't think it's so black and white as the way you've described it. I think there are others who are publishing on this same right, the same observation. I mean, I've seen a few papers, different groups, they mention your work on this question of heterogeneity, and I think even the hardliners from Marsh are forced to soften their stance. So can you give us what your impression is of what your colleagues are doing and how are they reaching different conclusions if they are taking into account heterogeneity compared to your conclusions? And what is the field, the narrow niche that you're in? How is it responding to your...
I'm most familiar with the work of Tom Britton and co-authors.
We'll put a link to, of course, we'll put a link to your paper. We'll put a link to the paper by Britton's group that was just published in Science. In Science,
it was published in Science, and his paper, their paper and our paper has same age. So we exchanged preprints when we first posted them, and that was at the end of it was at the very beginning of May. Ours had been at the end of April, so end of April, beginning of May, that's when these two papers were developed. So I know that one particularly well, and I can point out what, in my view, the difference is, and why is it that they estimate 40% herd immunity, 40-something%, and we estimate lower, 20 or less. So so the way they incorporate heterogeneity in their model, the way they estimate the heterogeneity that goes into their model, is based on data from contact surveys. So people, a number of people in a population are given a diary, and they are asked for each day to say how many contacts they had. And based on that, you see that some people just have 2 contacts, others may have 50 or something, and so the raw data, that's how it looks like. And I think the main difference between their study and our study is how this data is actually processed for incorporating in a model. So they built these so-called age-structured matrices. So they stratified population in 5-year in age groups, so 5-year age groups, and for each age group they calculate the average of the number of contacts that people within that age group have. So there is a degree of averaging, that all the raw variation doesn't go into the model. It's reduced. Heterogeneity is reduced before it enters the model in the form of these contact matrices. And we'd like to include the individual variation at the individual level. But instead of going and try to measure that directly, so we say, well, we know that if we include more or less variation in our model, the curves, the epidemic curves that the model will generate are different. Right. So we are going to do this in reverse. We are going to let the shape of the epidemic curve tell us what coefficient of variation our model should have in order to produce a curve that looks most similar possible to the data. So it's not surprising, once you understand this, it's not surprising at all that the herd immunity thresholds of Britton et al. Are higher than our herd immunity thresholds. It's just by design, by study design, that's expected. And of course, if you want to do a homogeneous model, what you do is to go even further, and instead of averaging your contacts into 5-year age groups, you just average for the whole population, and then you get a model that is even more homogeneous, and you get 60% herd immunity threshold. Right.
No, that's a very good point.
But also, they didn't. I don't see that. I mean, they didn't. Did they fit? Did they try to fit their models to the curves that already existed? They did not. Correct.
No.
Theirs is purely a simulation.
Yeah, it's a simulation, but they introduced heterogeneity in their model in this way.
Right.
So they got hold of data from contact surveys. They used, I think, an R0 2.5 that had been estimated in the literature, and they introduced these values. They introduced these parameter values in their models, and they generated, they calculated herd immunity threshold and generated theoretical curves. So in a way,
the very interesting thing about their theoretical curves is that they do fit some of what we see in different parts of the United States, right? So, you know, there are places that went through their epidemics early on, and they had, you know, they went up and they go up and down, and then there are places in the United States, it was such a huge country that locked down to a significant extent and had very, very small curves. And then as everything started to open up, suddenly they have another curve, and that looks very much like, you know, they have this model in their figure 1 of the plot of overall infected versus how severely you lock down. If you lock down the most early on, you will have a small curve because you can't extinguish it completely, but then you have another curve later on, whereas, you know, perhaps there's some sweet spot in terms of how much you lock down where you don't necessarily have that second curve, and that seems to be interesting at the very least.
Yeah, but going back to your comment about how important these differences are, if it's 20 or 40 or 60, it's so important to what the value for this reinfection threshold actually is in terms of planning ahead. I think we should really try to focus in trying to understand what this threshold really should be, instead of trying to defend our own version and say that, you know, ours is better than the others, because it's actually very relevant. It's very relevant for society. It's crucial for deciding what to do. And it's not just the value of the threshold itself. I think there's also a lot of discussion. The threshold is this and that. What does it mean, the threshold? What is the exact definition? Should we use a different definition? You know, that's not very useful. I think it's that the threshold, with the threshold comes a big epidemic, or a big second wave, or a large, so a big second wave or a small second wave. I think we need to actually look at the projections, not just the herd immunity threshold, but look at the projected second waves and see when they are expected to come, what size of second waves we are expecting. And of course, this is intimately related to the value of the herd immunity threshold. Because the herd immunity threshold itself, you will not see. It's not something that we will see happening. It's just, some people have also asked me, what do we see when we cross herd immunity threshold? We don't see anything, actually, because when we cross herd immunity threshold, we may be under some kind of social distancing anyway, and the herd immunity threshold is in relation to conditions back to normal, behavior back to normal. But with a model, and I think we absolutely need a model if we want to estimate, if we want to know if the herd immunity threshold has already passed. We cannot observe it directly while we are under social distancing. But yeah, it has huge implications for what will come.
But what's the prior history of this? Meaning, can we not rely on the history of, say, other respiratory viruses, like say the flu? Like, do we have a sense of any other viruses where we can say, okay, this was the herd immunity threshold, where everyone agrees that this was the herd immunity threshold? Like for the flu, is herd immunity threshold 20%, 50%, 60%? What is it?
I think the herd immunity threshold has been used mostly in the context of designing vaccination programs, and not so much in the context of epidemics and the immunity acquired by natural infection. When you mentioned the flu, I imagine you are talking about seasonal epidemics of flu. In reality, every year we cross the epidemic, the herd immunity thresholds up and down with flu. So we have an epidemic at the beginning of the flu season because we are below threshold. So we have an epidemic, and the epidemic declines because we passed the threshold.
Right. So that's very, that's something. It's an extremely important point, but it just only hit me just actually from reading your work, because this question of seasonality. I mean, in people's minds, we have the flu because it's the season of the flu, and we stop having the flu because the season is gone, right? Whereas another way to look at it is actually no, there's actually you hit immunity threshold, and right? How do you distinguish the two, or what, or how can you parse that out?
I think it's both, because if it was just immunity, you would not expect this to be always in the winter. Right. So I think the seasonality is like a pulse, and it increases increases are not in part of the year, and decreases increases in the winter and decreases in summer. And I think this is well understood, how temperature and humidity can drive that. But that's not the only thing, because you could have seasonality, but and virus could be there all year long, like you have for tuberculosis, for example. In tuberculosis, you are always above threshold. There's no herd immunity threshold for tuberculosis. You are always above. But even if you had some seasonality, even if people are slightly more likely, more susceptible in the winter than they are in the summer, the seasonality is hardly noticeable, because you have an endemic state with a little waving that it's hardly visible.
But Dr. Gomez, what was the basis for why epidemiologists were telling us in March, even now actually, that herd immunity threshold is 50%? What is the basis for them saying that in this type of a pandemic? Are you saying that they're basing it on vaccination things, which is totally a different thing? I mean, how do they come up with that number?
If you use a model that is homogeneous
so if you use a model that doesn't exist
or not
in the
sufficiently heterogeneous, you'd come with values like that. You
I mean, I think
you can derive this formula for herd immunity threshold, 1 minus 1 over R naught. It's correct. It comes out of a homogeneous model.
So if you use a hopelessly simplistic, non-existing in the real world model, then you come up with a number of 50%.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, the work I'm doing, the work we are now, we are now trying to present. It's new, so it's not. It's not. I think these. It's not established.
It's not how they've thought about it.
But for a point of clarification, Dr. Gomez, are you saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but by introducing this variation in susceptibility in the model, don't you fit your model better to the data? Did you say that
it fits better? It fits better, and I can explain. That's interesting. So at the beginning of the epidemic, we couldn't get any signal for what the value of this coefficient of variation would be. So we could not estimate, we could not have estimated coefficient of variation. We could not estimate the herd immunity threshold at the end of April, when we first submitted our first preprint. That's why we don't do that. That's why we present scenarios. If coefficient of variation is 1, we get this. If coefficient of variation is 3, we get that. We don't know what's the coefficient of variation for COVID, but if we look at other diseases like tuberculosis and malaria, and also data from super spreading studies in COVID actually, and in SARS-1, we get these values that are about 2, 3, these kind of values. If COVID has these coefficients of variation, then this is what we would expect, herd immunity thresholds between 10 and 20%. But this was in April. So in June, in June and July, when we submitted our second preprint, this was completely different. The data that had come in this latter part of the epidemic, so after lockdown, once lockdown starts to be lifted and the social distancing relaxed, then the homogeneous models would just want to go up in cases. It's just not like the data at all.
Right.
And according to our model, it just kept going down. You relax social distances and cases continue going down. It was at that stage that we could estimate with great confidence what the coefficient of variation was.
But I mean, if you're saying, and I have all reasons to believe you, that your model fits the data better, I think eventually that message is going to come through, right? I mean, I think, it's truth will have to prevail, and people will it'll become more and more accepted among. Time will tell, but I mean,
I hope so, and that will be good for my career that my ideas get accepted. But I think more important than my career is that these ideas will actually be useful to protect people and to make make best strategies. And that has been very disappointing that our ideas have kind of been pushed off to the margin as if they were not like the mainstream, the main current of epidemic modeling, and they are just kind of this curiosity. Oh, look, if you do heterogeneity, you get these weird low herd immunity thresholds.
Yeah, so I have two questions related questions on that point. Is that number one, there may be a reaction not to your work, but the projections based on the wrong models from early on. I mean, particularly the Imperial College model has been discredited. I mean, in many ways, in the eyes of many. But not only that particular model, but there may be kind of a rejection, at least among regular folks, of models in general, because they say, well, these models were so far off that we can't trust models, mathematical models in general, and perhaps there may be a model fatigue, if you will. I don't think that's the case among scientists and people in the field, but there may be some of that, in the broader population. That's one thing. And number two is related to the disagreement among people in your field, and I think that's what Anish was alluding to, is that epidemiologists, modelers, statisticians, are human beings. They are citizens. They have certain views about what ought to be done, right? And those views sometimes are very difficult to, keep separate from what the data shows and what the methods show and what the science shows. Do you think, that's playing a part in, do you see that as playing a part, that people are being influenced by,
I think people are very busy. Everybody's trying to produce results very fast, and they may not necessarily have time to read everything that's coming out. And our results are not mainstream. Our models are not mainstream. So I think people have.
Now that you've been on the Akkad and Koka report, you're going to be mainstream. I can guarantee.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. So and I think our ideas have been overlooked as being sort of a mathematical. It doesn't help that I'm a mathematician either. So it's a mathematical sophistication that these mathematicians added to your models, to their models. Same with Tom Britton. They are also mathematicians, adding these mathematical sophistications to their models. But we are the real epidemiologists. We just continue doing the things like we are. Well, we are doing. There was a degree of that, but that's because people are busy. It's because this is an emergency, and in normal conditions, you wouldn't. I think things would have worked better. For me, it was disappointing because I actually, I've been working on epidemic modeling for 20 years. It's not just like I am a sort of an abstract mathematician. That's how I started, but that was 30 years ago. And I was very disappointed because I really believed in the value of these ideas, and I think we could have developed better strategies, and people could have suffered less from.
Yeah, but the game is not over yet. I think it's still
yes, that's
right.
True.
So,
that's
but there's
true.
been, but Dr. Gomez is right. There's been a tremendous amount of suffering already. So we'll see what. But Dr. Gomez, I think it would have been almost impossible for anyone to get anyone to believe without things happening that weren't predicted by the conventional model. The conventional models that I remember in the New York Times, Mark Lipsitch, Pritzker, these epidemiologists saying was that was that you would have these, using this homogeneous model, you would have this small bump and then this other big bump if you opened up too quickly, right?
Yeah.
And again, without having what's happened in Sweden, what's now happened in England, what's happening in New York, Spain, right? Without that happening, without showing that you probably have reached herd immunity in these places, because these places are now open, they're still socially distanced, they're doing their things, but they're not completely back to normal. They're not having massive, they're not 100% back in terms of mobility and all that stuff. But still, they have much smaller epidemics than what would be predicted in the conventional model, correct?
Yeah, and I
So
think they are manageable of epidemics. They are local outbreaks.
Right.
I'm here in Portugal, and I saw it happening. The north of Portugal, where I am, was most affected at the beginning, and then after lockdown, we have outbreaks in Lisbon that hadn't been so affected, but not in the north.
And those little outbreaks give ammunition to the other side to say, aha, if
exactly.
we need to lock down,
now
right,
it's going
right.
to grow, but then
But that's the other important piece I wanted to ask you, Dr. Gomez. These are all, what you focused on is cases, right? Case positivity. Now, case positivity, as we know, is hugely dependent on the ability to test, right? Who has testing capability, what the test characteristic is, what the sensitivity of test is, right? So sensitivity, specificity, what of the tests are. So would it be more worthwhile and perhaps more meaningful to use death numbers when trying to do some of this modeling work? Because that's much harder. I mean, that's not even that's also not perfect in terms of attribution of death, but that's much
okay.
Much
My
cleaner.
my worry about using death data, I guess, comes from my mindset of variation and selection. If you have so we have variation in susceptibility. So people are differentially likely to acquire the infection, but there may also be variation in susceptibility in acquiring disease. So in severity of disease, some people, two infected people, one will become very ill and the other is not.
Yeah.
And so how are these two variabilities correlated? Do the people who are more likely to get the infection are also more likely to get the disease? Is this a positive correlation, or is it the opposite? Because we have this variation in our models, we have this selection occurring. Like I said, people who are infected first are the people who are more susceptible, but are they also more likely to get disease or less likely to get disease? There's probably some correlation.
But isn't that for us, the clinicians, and for just patients and stuff? Isn't it more relevant whether or not we will develop
but I don't
significant
know
morbidity?
But I don't know what the correlation is. If I knew, if there was data on that correlation, I could incorporate that in my models and just run the models with confidence. But once I have this variation laid out in the models, I need to make an assumption, and I'm trying to minimize the assumptions I make. I would need to make an assumption about how likelihood to get severe disease is correlated with the likelihood to get infection, and I don't know what the correlation is. I can explore different possibilities, and this may actually be one of the factors that will eventually explain, for example, why the deaths are decreasing more than the cases in many cases.
But I'm sorry, I don't understand. Because just like there's an individual susceptibility to getting infected, right? There may be an individual, there is an individual susceptibility to death. So some people get SARS-CoV-2 and they get a little sniffle. Some people get it maybe asymptomatic. Some people get it and end up dying. So how does it matter to you? I mean, the beauty of your model is that you don't have to incorporate all the different, the beauty of the way you do things is that you don't have to incorporate and figure out what exactly it is. We know, for instance, clinically
but because my model includes variation in susceptibility, and that needs to include, in order to include variation in severity of disease or likely.
Why not just do
dying,
variation in susceptibility of death? Isn't it the same thing?
I need to include variation in susceptibility as well. Otherwise, the selection on the susceptible pool is not going to be occurring.
Right.
I need to have more people. Some people will be more prone to leave the susceptible pool earlier than others.
Oh, okay,
I need to have
because
that.
you're still.
Otherwise, the model will just behave like a homogeneous model. It's quite subtle. You need to have not all kinds of variation lower the reinfection threshold. If you have variation in infectiousness, for example, it doesn't change the model. It doesn't lower the herd immunity threshold. It doesn't. So it must be, you need to have some kind of variation that leads to this selection effect that is happening on susceptible pool. So it's very important. I would like to know how to do that, or to have the data telling me how to do that, to have variation in death or in severity of symptoms, but I need to know how that correlates with
I understand what you're saying.
susceptibility to infection.
So what I'm saying is you wouldn't be trying to model herd immunity threshold, because a lot of your work involves trying to get at herd immunity threshold. You wouldn't be arriving at that with the death data, but you'd be making predictive modeling of how bad something could be given, because one of the issues with your model that I find as a clinical guy is that cases in some senses are irrelevant when you, if it, not irrelevant, that's a bad word. For instance, in COVID, with COVID, like 80% of the folks that die are over the age of 70, right? So as somebody who's trying to figure out how to implement, say, public health policies, it may be very significant to know that, hey, this is much more a problem.
That will be a next
cases. But anyway.
Yeah, that will be a natural next step and an important one. But so far we just the first thing we wanted to do was to introduce this idea that it depends on what you define as a research question. Our research question was, how does this individual variation going to affect the size of the epidemic?
Have you spoken to some of the epidemiologists directly, or have you corresponded with them in any way?
Yeah, okay. I did. Yeah.
Oh,
and I think the reactions I get is that yes, certainly this individual variation is important and will be playing a role and will be having an effect, but I don't think it should be as large as what you say. But I think what disappoints me is that people say these without having actually done it, without having actually prove me mathematically that this is too much of an effect. Why, and people criticize lots of things. You make this assumption, it may not, a model with this assumption may not be robust, the results may change if you change these, but they think I have infinite time to do everything, and I just, my time is full. I'm just doing as much as I can with the time I have. I was really hoping that people would engage and just do it, even if they prove I'm wrong or only half right or something, but actually engage into the research process.
In practical terms, Professor Gomes, I mean, I think you announced on Twitter that your paper, which is in preprint right now and available for review, was rejected from one journal. I mean, aren't you going to try to keep pushing it?
Yeah, it is now under review. So we well, let's see. We don't know what will happen, but I think until it is certified as peer reviewed, it's not going to be used by policymakers. So it's a shame. So it's a shame that we are just
sure.
That won't stop Donald Trump. He does not. You may find him calling you soon.
Right. Professor Gomes, we thank you so much. We've really abused of your generous
time,
gift of your time, and it was a fantastic episode. We'll encourage a lot of people. I'd like people to follow you because you're active on Twitter. What is your? Can you tell us? We'll have it in the show notes, but for the audience listening, what is your handle? Twitter handle?
Yeah, my Twitter handle is mgmgomez1.
Okay, and Gomez is with an S.
With
right?
an S, yeah.
Yes.
And I should say I'm new to Twitter, so I'm just trying to
You know,
figure out
your next project is to figure out the R naught for a tweet and the population dynamics of the Twitter mob, how the Twitter mob behaves, and if we can develop herd immunity to to viral tweets.
Right.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to following you, and we wish you very well in your work. Very important.
Thank you very much.